you've covered a lot of territory, so there's a lot that we can talk about, I think. My question, in a way, is to ask you to elaborate on a point that you were making just on the level of security. I think you made a very convincing case that when two countries, say China and the US, share a common enemy, that brings them together. And obviously the case of the former Soviet Union is such a clear one. I mean, it's really remarkable when you look at the history of US-China relations. You know, we go from allies to enemies to allies to enemies again based on whether the Soviet Union is there or not, basically.
And whether the Soviet Union is threatening China. In the 1950s, there's no threat from the Soviet Union.
Yes, that's right. So there's, and then there's no relationship with the US. There's nothing to draw the US and China together. Now, the flip side of that coin you were pointing out is when there is no external enemy, you said you can either have no security relationship or you can fall into competition. And I guess I wanted to ask you to elaborate a little on your thinking of that conditionality. In other words, what pushes countries into cooperation versus having, competition versus no relationship in the absence of external enemies? How are you thinking analytically about that? Two things I wanted to throw at you as ideas is things about sort of more directly, how do certain countries' domestic polities perceive the country in question? So, for example, you gave the very important example of the end of the Cold War, which is the beginning of the end of close US-China security cooperation. But that also coincides with the Tiananmen massacre, which had a dramatic impact on US public opinion directly towards China, not towards the Soviet Union. Meanwhile, in Beijing, they're looking at the execution of Ceausescu in Romania. They're concerned about liberal ideology as a threat to the CCP. So I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit about where your thinking is on that aspect of when there is no common enemy, what happens?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a really good question. And part of that is driven by really two questions, the way I see it. So the first one is, can you afford not to have a security relationship at all, of either competition or cooperation, right? And I would say that if we're talking about small or medium powers on the other side of the world, yes, in theory, at least you could. Right? It is not essential for China to have any security relationship to France. And it's not absolutely and obviously essential for France to have a security relationship to China. I mean, they may come to see that they need to have a security relationship of either cooperation or competition, but there's no natural necessity to it. I would argue that before the Second World War, the US and China are kind of in that same camp. They don't have to have a security relationship. I'm not sure we could say that to them, because not only are they great powers, they're global powers. Right? So even though they're not near each other geographically, I don't think that China could afford to say, we just don't care about the United States in terms of national security. And I don't think most people in the US would say, we don't care about China in terms of national security. They have to think about each other because they're both global actors in a way that neither one of them really was before the Second World War. And so in that sense, the world has changed and their position within it has changed such that they have to deal with each other, even when they're not close to each other. But they don't necessarily have to be enemies. They don't necessarily have to have security competition. They don't necessarily have conflicting security interests, the way that, for example, China and Japan do. Right? So in that sense, I do think that in the more contemporary Europe, it wouldn't be feasible to disengage and not have a security relationship for a great power and China, even if that great power is far away. The second question is about kind of domestic political perceptions. I wonder why you would ask that. How do people in society view the other country? What are they thinking about that? And I think that is rather important. But I would argue that it has less of an impact on security than it would on trade or economic relations, at least in the case of this distant great power, right? If we're talking about a proximate great power, right, in, say, Japan, right, the perceptions of China in Japan, the perceptions of Japan in China, I think that does have a significant influence on how inflamed or cooled down that security tension is. So I think there's always a security tension there, and I definitely think that strongly negative perceptions of the other in each of those countries, as exist right now, for example, can drive that tension into a higher. In the case of the US, I don't see that. And the reason I don't see that is if we go back to the 1970s, the perception of the US and China in the early 1970s was abysmal, right? And the perception of China in the US was almost as bad, in part driven by people like Richard Nixon, who for 20 years was decrying how terrible China was. And so that all went to one side very quickly when it was determined that, oh, we should cooperate in terms of security, at least in some basic way. And they were very explicit about it. And although there's this triangle theory that was birthed at that time, that logic overpowered the domestic political perception of the other. But when it comes to economic relations with a distant great power, I think it matters a great deal. And that's where basically I think the Pelosi, sidelining of Pelosi and others who wanted to tie trade nations to human rights progress is a very important step in the U.S. relationship with China. I think in other closer relationships, let's say in the Southeast Asian cases, where you have proximate and small powers, I definitely think that domestic political perception is huge, which I was trying to get at in some ways, and that can really drive the security dynamic. There's no obvious security competition or security issue or tension between those states, but if there is a strongly negative view of China, a strongly negative view, at least in some quarters, of the ethnic Chinese population in that country, a strongly negative view of political actors in that country who are painted as being pro-China. Like, for example, the Communist Party of Indonesia in the 1960s. That is a recipe for mass violence, often, and targeted ethnic violence inside those states, and for greatly inflamed security tension, as we see again and again. And long term, where we see those persistence of those kind of negative perceptions in significant quarters of domestic politics, for example, in the Philippines or in Indonesia, I think that is part of what stands in the way of a more positive security relationship for those countries with China as compared to, say, Thailand or Myanmar, which also have significant ethnic Chinese populations where there isn't as much of a negative portrayal in other quarters of politics, or as much of a negative perception of China as a country outside inland politics. And so that's part of, I think, what makes it easier for them to have less tense security relations with China. There's more than that, a lot more than that in terms of domestic politics and other factors like how those countries do in the United States. But if we try to boil it down to the simplest kind of smallest number of factors, this one isn't